South.
What was the official position where Canada was concerned, or the British Empire's, on the war going on in the States?
That's where the problem started. The war starts, right? Now think about it. This is a civil war. This is an illegal secession. And Washington is expecting, hoping that the British Empire, Britain, will kind of side with the legitimate government. Well, what Britain does, and therefore Canada, because we were a colony at the time, Britain says we were neutral. We're going to be neutral. So what that meant, though, concretely, is it meant the South, which was besieged by the North in a bloody war. Its cities at times were burning, were certainly under blockade. There was a lot of misery. What could the elite, the aristocrats, not to mention the mercenaries and the soldiers, do? If they were in Montreal and Toronto, they were spies, they were scoundrels, but they didn't have to hide. Canada was neutral. They openly campaigned. So that's what neutrality meant. We became a haven for the South.
Could you draw a picture of where the support was and what it was like across the province of Canada at the time?
It was widespread and mainly in the elites. The elites in Canada supported the South. Why? Well, for several reasons. There were economic reasons. 80% of Britain's cotton came from the South. Britain and Halifax and parts of Canada were doing a brisk trade to support the South. Running the blockade illegally, you could make a fortune doing that. So there was an economic reason to support the South. Secondly, there was a class and aristocratic reason. There was a natural sympathy for the aristocrats and the elites of the South compared to Lincoln's populism and the fact that he seemed to be way too much in favor of the people. And finally, it is true that the Lincoln government was annexationist. There were members of his cabinet who were always calling to annex Canada. So the leaders of our country felt a certain hostility towards that. But whatever the reasons were, what was Canada in the midst of this Civil War? You start at the very top. You start at our political leaders. John A. Macdonald will be our first prime minister by the time the Civil War is over in 1867. It's 1864, and Canadian politicians are gathering in Charlottetown in one of the many Confederation conferences to set up our country. And what does John A. Macdonald say? He talks about the brave soldiers of the South. He talks about how even though they're only they're outnumbered, they are putting up a brave battle. But among many common people, there was support for the Union, and a few brave elite members, the most notable being George Brown. George Brown was the founder of the Globe newspaper, who eventually became the Globe and Mail, a staunch abolitionist. His newspaper was openly pro-Lincoln, and he was a lone voice. He would battle the other Toronto leaders. And most importantly, ordinary Canadians sign up en masse in tens of thousands to go fight for the Union Army. So you see this real gap.
Who are those people who decide to sign up and fight in this Civil War happening in the South?
It's a really important question because when I've been talking around the country about the book, sometimes people say, well, wait a minute, should we impose our standards today, presentism as it's called, right, to criticize our ancestors because our values are different and times were different? And I think that's a valid point. The point is, though, is that in the Civil War, the choice was there. It's not like you didn't know that slavery was bad. People made their choices. So one of the wonderful characters, I think, who illustrates that is a woman, right? Emma Edmonds is a farm girl from New Brunswick who's already chafing at the restrictions imposed on women and the lack of adventure, not to mention a steady income and independence. The war starts, and she has this wonderful line in her memoirs where she says, "What am I to do?" And I think that's the question we all have to pose today. What do you do in a moment of crisis, in a moment of conflict, in an existential threat to your values? And she says, it's not my war, it's not my country, but she signs up disguised as a man and will serve for 2 years in the Union Army. And when she eventually reveals herself, she will become one of the most famous women ever to have served in the army. So,
But not a typical case.
not a typical case. Much more typical were the ordinary men. Edward Doherty was a Montrealer working in New York. Remember, hundreds of thousands of Canadians had moved to the U.S. for economic and other reasons. He signs up mainly for adventure and for the cause. And Edward Doherty will rise through the ranks. And right after Lincoln is assassinated on Friday night, dies Saturday morning. Monday morning, Edward Doherty, Montrealer, Canadian, is sitting literally in Lafayette Park, right outside the White House. He gets a message from a courier to report to the War Department. He will be assigned to lead the military regiment that will track down in 12 days Lincoln's assassin, John Wilkes Booth, and eventually kill him. So that's another ordinary Canadian who makes a dramatic choice. Perhaps most important, of course, were the Black Canadians. Many Black Canadians who were born here, others who were descendants of escaped slaves, all through southern Ontario, signed up. Many of them died and perished in the Civil War. And the most famous is Anderson Abbott, the first Black doctor, native-born in Canada, who will write to the Lincoln administration and get accepted as a doctor and will end up shaking Lincoln's hand in the White House at a party. So it's incredible because, looking back at it now, you realize these were choices, right? A farm girl disguises herself to fight in the Union Army. A Black Canadian doctor will meet Lincoln and fight in the Union Army. And at the same time, most newspaper editors, many church leaders, bankers, businessmen, leading politicians will express disgust with Lincoln and side with the South.
An American in Canada. The New York Times, July 20th, 1864. The frontier towns and watering places in Canada are pretty well filled with celebrated conspirators, busy as bees at the present day, hatching up mischief, plotting treason, poisoning the minds of the Canadian people,